Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Monday, October 23rd, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today, Blinken rejects the idea of a Gaza ceasefire. So Secretary of State Antony Blinken on Sunday rejected the idea of the U.S. calling for a ceasefire in Gaza when confronted with the massive number of child casualties in Israel's onslaught. So this was during an interview on CBS News on Face the Nation. And Margaret Brennan, who is the host, asked Blinken, quote, UNICEF says 1,524 children have been killed in the Gaza Strip during these bombings. Why isn't the U.S. calling for at least a temporary ceasefire, end quote. So Blinken replied, claiming that the death of children on both sides hits him right in the heart, but he did not criticize Israel's vicious bombing campaign. He pointed to the U.S. effort to get Israel to allow aid trucks to enter Gaza through Egypt. And Brennan then asked why the U.S. is not pushing for at least a temporary ceasefire. She pressed the question again, and Blinken said, quote, Israel has to do everything it can to make sure this doesn't happen again. Freezing things in place where they are now would allow Hamas to remain where it is and to repeat what it's done sometime in the future. No country could accept that, end quote. So it sounds like a familiar argument because Blinken made a similar case earlier this year when rejecting the idea of a ceasefire in Ukraine ahead of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. He said then that a pause in fighting would only benefit Russia. And we know from the Discord leaks and other reports at the time that U.S. officials knew before Ukraine launched its counteroffensive that they wouldn't gain any significant territory, but Blinken pushed for it anyway. So, it seems like in every conflict that the U.S. is involved in, Blinken is always against the idea of a ceasefire. He's against the idea of peace. And now, looking back, it's clear that at this point, Ukraine's counteroffensive has failed despite months and months of brutal fighting, which is still going on. I know I haven't been covering it much lately, but there's still been a lot of fighting along the front, and Ukraine has taken very heavy casualties. So back to the interview that he did on Sunday, Blinken also claimed that it was Hamas's fault that American citizens in Gaza could not leave despite the fact that the enclave is under an Israeli blockade and Israel actually closed its border crossing and is not letting people in. So this is a new one. I have not heard the U.S. blame Hamas for people not being able to leave Gaza. And this is specifically about Americans, Palestinian Americans in Gaza, dual citizens. Blinken said, quote, we've had people come to Rafah, the crossing with Egypt, and to date, at least, Hamas has blocked them from leaving, showing once again its total disregard for civilians of any kind who are stuck in Gaza. So really, the ball is in Hamas's court in terms of letting people who want to leave, civilians from third countries, including Americans, get out of Gaza, end quote. So again, this seems like a completely false claim. I was looking at reports in recent days that have spoken with Palestinian Americans or citizens of other countries, and they were told to go to the Rafah border crossing, but they were not allowed into Egypt. There's no indication that they're saying Hamas is preventing them from leaving. Looks like Blinken is just trying to deflect the blame here. And according to a report from NBC News, there are up to 600 Americans stuck in Gaza, and they say they're not receiving any help from the U.S. to get out. And you hear the talking points from the hawks in Congress. They're saying Biden's not doing anything to get the hostages out of, the American hostages that were taken from Israel, who are likely dual citizens as well. As far as I know, they all are. But anyway, this NBC report, they spoke with Palestinian Americans at the Rafah border crossing who said, the U.S. isn't helping us, Biden's not helping us, the embassy's not helping us. They're not getting any help when it comes to getting out of Gaza, and here you have Blinken blaming it on Hamas. They blame it all on Hamas. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. sends more assets to the Middle East as escalation risks rise. So on Saturday, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin announced the U.S. was sending more air defense systems to the Middle East as U.S. forces in the region are coming under attack due to President Biden's backing of Israel's onslaught on Gaza. So Austin blamed the escalations on Iran, although there's no sign that Iran plans to get directly involved in the fighting. Austin said, quote, following detailed discussions with President Biden on recent escalations by Iran and its proxy forces across the Middle East region, today I directed a series of additional steps to further strengthen the Department of Defense posture in the region, end quote. So Austin said that he had activated the deployment of Terminal High Altitude Area Defense with THAAD anti-missile defense system and additional Patriot battalions, which is the other type of air defense system. And he says they're sending them to multiple locations throughout the region. He also placed an additional number of forces on prepare to deploy orders, and we know from earlier reports that the Pentagon ordered 2,000 troops to be prepared to deploy to the region to support Israel, though they're not expected to serve in a combat role. So it sounds like more troops are being placed on that prepare to deploy. So Austin's statement on Saturday came after U.S. bases in Syria and Iraq came under attack with only minor injuries reported so far, at least. I know in one instance in Iraq, there was some sort of false alarm, and there was a contractor there that had a heart attack and died, but sort of an indirect death due to these attacks. And in Iraq, an airbase in Iraq, in Western Iraq, the Ain al-Assad airbase came under rocket attack on Sunday, and on Saturday it also came under a drone attack. So these attacks, since the last show, have continued. So both Austin and Blinken said on Sunday that the U.S. is ready to respond to further attacks on U.S. forces. Blinken said, quote, we don't want to see our forces or our personnel come under fire, but if that happens, we're ready for it, end quote. The U.S. has also intercepted missiles in the Red Sea that were fired from Yemen and likely targeted at Israel. So this is interesting. I covered that in the last show, that the U.S. said it intercepted missiles and drones fired from Yemen that they said were fired by the Houthis. According to Task and Purpose, the guided missile destroyer USS Carney actually spent 9 hours downing 15 drones and 4 cruise missiles fired from Yemen, which is a far larger attack or missile and drone launch than the Pentagon initially reported. So the Pentagon said the missiles and drones they said something like they were likely targeting Israel. They didn't say for sure that they were, but that seemed to be the case. So the U.S. says those missiles were fired by the Houthis. They have not attributed blame for the attacks on U.S. bases in Syria and Iraq, although some of the lesser-known Shia militias have taken credit, at least for some of the attacks. So again, I would not be surprised if we start to see U.S. airstrikes against these Shia militias that operate in Iraq and Syria, and things could really escalate from there. Biden has done that before when U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria have come under attack, and now I wouldn't be surprised if he does it again, but it could be much different this time with everything that's going on in the region. And the steps that Austin announced on Saturday are in addition to other U.S. deployments in the region to support Israel, which includes the 2 aircraft carrier strike groups that are there, 2 amphibious vessels carrying thousands of Marines, and additional fighter jets. And so the threat is that the U.S. will intervene directly if Hezbollah, really launches a big attack on Israel. All right, the next one here. Israel to consider civilians in North Gaza terrorist accomplices. So the Israeli military has told Palestinian civilians living in North Gaza that if they don't evacuate to the south, they will be considered an accomplice in a terrorist organization. So the warning was made in threatening leaflets dropped by Israeli drones on Saturday. According to Reuters, these leaflets read, quote, urgent warning to residents of Gaza. Your presence north of Wadi Gaza puts your life in danger. Whoever chooses not to leave North Gaza to the south of Wadi Gaza might be identified as an accomplice in a terrorist organization, end quote. So Israel previously ordered the evacuation of northern Gaza, and that's an area that's home to 1.1 million people, almost half of the population of the entire Gaza Strip. And since Gaza is under blockade, their only option is to flee to the south, but there's also constant Israeli airstrikes down there. And it seems like Israel is preparing for the ground invasion to focus on the north. So some Gazans have fled to the south, while others have refused to leave their homes because they just don't, feel safe leaving, I guess. And others have sought shelter at hospitals, hoping that they won't be targeted. And Israel's telling hospitals to evacuate. According to the Palestinian Red Crescent, Israel ordered the evacuation of the Al-Quds hospital, which is housing more than 400 patients and 12,000 displaced civilians. So since Israel has unleashed its bombing campaign on Gaza in the wake of the October 7th Hamas attack, at least 4,651 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza, including 1,756 children. And this is according to the Gaza Health Ministry. On the Israeli side, at least 1,405 people have been killed. So Gazans are also suffering from food and water shortages due to the Israeli siege. A limited number of aid trucks have been allowed to enter Gaza from Egypt, and they're carrying medical supplies, but they're not carrying, Israel's not letting them take fuel in to power the hospital generators. And aid agencies have said that the aid that has been let in is just a drop in the ocean for Gaza's 2.3 million residents. All right, the next one here. So this is a story from the New York Times, and it is about how 2 American hostages were set free by Hamas. And so this is interesting because the way that this happened apparently was through diplomacy. These 2 women, Israeli Americans, were released, and according to this report, it was through diplomacy, and the mediator seems to be Qatar, where in Qatar there are Hamas leaders living there. Qatar is known to fund Hamas. And it looks like there was some diplomacy that got these 2 released. And this report also says that officials in Qatar are saying Hamas is saying that if Israel stops the bombing, even, I'm not sure if they mean temporarily or just a ceasefire, a permanent ceasefire, that they will release all the civilian hostages. So they have, it's estimated that there's about 200 hostages there, and some are civilians and some are military. And Hamas is saying that they'll release all the civilians if there's a stop to the Israeli bombing. So it shows that diplomacy is actually an option here, despite what everybody's saying. And I would think if you really care about these hostages, you wouldn't just be decimating Gaza. How do you handle a hostage situation with negotiations? All right, if you want to go check that out, there's some more details there. So the next one here, the White House seeks $105 billion to arm Israel, Ukraine, and Taiwan. So we knew this was coming. Kyle Anzalone wrote this up on Friday. So the full package that the White House has asked Congress to authorize is worth $105 billion, and that includes $61.4 billion for Ukraine. The idea is to get through the 2024 election. Israel will receive $14.3 billion in assistance, with $10.6 billion for air and missile defense support. The aid would be in addition to the $3.8 billion that Israel receives each year. The bill includes $7.4 billion for several initiatives to increase Washington's military posture in the Indo-Pacific. That includes $2 billion for foreign governments to buy American weapons, and Taiwan is going to receive some of those billions. I'm not sure exactly how much. So money to fund Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. All military aid, all to fuel, ongoing hot wars, and then the aid for Taiwan is just going to increase tensions with China. And additionally, there's $14 billion packed in there for border security. So big spending. When it comes to Congress, they still haven't elected a speaker in the House, so I'm not really sure what is going on with that. Or who's another possible candidate, because I know Jim Jordan failed to win. All right, so the next one here, Israel says a soldier was killed during a raid into Gaza. So the Israeli military said Sunday that 1 Israeli soldier was killed and 3 were injured by an anti-tank missile during a raid into the besieged Gaza Strip. The statement from the Israeli military came as the Qassem's brigade, which is the armed wing of Hamas, said on Telegram that it had repelled an Israeli ground raid. So the Israeli military said that 1 soldier was killed and 1 was moderately injured and 2 were lightly injured as a result of an anti-tank missile launch. So the fighting took place near Khan Yunis, which is a city in southern Gaza. Hamas said that its fighters destroyed an Israeli tank and 2 bulldozers during the raid. The Israeli military said that an IDF tank fired back at militants they were fighting in Gaza. So according to CNN, and I believe this is right, they say that this incident appears to be the first time that the Israeli military and Hamas fought on the ground in Gaza since the Hamas attack on southern Israel on October 7th. The incident occurred as Israel said it was intensifying airstrikes in Gaza ahead of an expected ground invasion. So an IDF spokesman said Sunday, quote, "We will deepen our attacks to minimize the dangers to our forces in the next stages of the war. We are going to increase the attacks from today," end quote. So they have just been pummeling Gaza with airstrikes, and they're saying they're going to increase it even more. All right, the next one here. Israel threatens to wipe Iran off the face of the earth if Hezbollah intervenes. So an Israeli official has vowed that Iran would be wiped off the face of the earth if Hezbollah opens up a northern front for Israel. So Israel and Hezbollah have been trading fire along the Lebanon-Israel border since the October 7th Hamas attack. There have been dozens of casualties, mainly on the Lebanon side, but Hezbollah has not launched a major assault on Israel yet. Still just exchange of fire across the border. So there has been some, I think, incursions into Israel from the Palestinian groups that are in the refugee camps in southern Israel. But as far as I know, there's been no big Hezbollah, ground attack. So Nir Barkat, who's Israel's Minister of Economy, he told the Mail on Sunday that if Hezbollah enters the war, Israel would not only eliminate the group, but would also target Iran. He said, quote, "The plan of Iran is to attack Israel on all fronts. If we find they intend to target Israel, we will not just retaliate to those fronts, but we will go to the head of the snake, which is Iran," end quote. So his warning comes as an Israeli ground invasion of Gaza appears to be imminent. He went on, quote, "Lebanon and Hezbollah are going to pay a heavy price, similar to what Hamas is going to pay. But that's not enough. The very clear message is that we are going to be going after the heads of Iran as well. Israel has a very clear message to our enemies. We are saying to them, look what's happening in Gaza. You are going to get the same treatment. If you attack us, we are going to wipe you off the face of the earth," end quote. So when it comes to Israeli threats against Iran, realistically, Israel does not have the capabilities to sustain a bombing campaign in Iran similar to what they're doing in Gaza without support from the U.S. And both Iran and Hezbollah have very formidable militaries. Israel had a really tough time against Hezbollah during the 2006 war. And they have very advanced missiles. So, it would be a lot for Israel to handle. But the thing is that Israel does have nuclear weapons. They have a secret nuclear weapons stockpile. So that makes threats like this, these aren't hollow threats. When you have an official with a nuclear armed state, the only nuclear armed state in the region, despite all the claims about Iran, they don't have nuclear weapons, but Israel does. So when they make threats like this, it could mean something. There's always something to be aware of. All right, so the next one here. Israel again bombs Syria's Damascus and Aleppo airports. So Israeli airstrikes simultaneously targeted Syria's 2 main international airports in Damascus and Aleppo for the second time since the October 7th Hamas attack. The airstrikes took place early Sunday morning and put both airports out of service. Syrian media reported that 1 civilian worker was killed and another was wounded. So Israel previously targeted both airports on October 12th, and then there was the strikes on October 14th against just the Aleppo airport. So this is becoming a pretty normal thing. And Israel has been bombing Syria for years now. They've had this sustained air campaign in Syria for a long time. And towards the second half of 2022, towards the end of the summer last year, they started really targeting the airports in Syria. And Israel frames this as attacks against Iran and Hezbollah's military presence in Syria, but they often kill Syrians and damage civilian infrastructure. All right, So the next one here, Israeli army kills 5 in Jenin mosque bombing and West Bank raids. So the Israeli military, this article is from the Middle East Eye, they killed 5 Palestinians in aerial and ground attacks across the occupied West Bank in the early hours of Sunday. So a reported Israeli fighter jet struck a mosque in Jenin around 3 a.m. local time, killing 2 people inside, according to the Palestinian Ministry of Health. Another 3 people were killed by Israeli troops during military raids in Tubas, Nablus, and Qabatia, south of Jenin. So at least 90 Palestinians, including 30 children, have been killed by Israeli troops and settlers in 16 days since the flare-up with Gaza started earlier this month. So that's a lot for the West Bank. I mean, if all this stuff wasn't going on in Gaza and this was happening, say, isolated from everything else in the West Bank, this would be huge news that this many people, there's this much violence. And the settlers in the West Bank are taking advantage of the whole situation in Gaza and just everything that's happening. And, you know, they want to steal the land and that Palestinians have in the West Bank and their homes. So they're just taking advantage of everything, and they're increasing attacks on Palestinians. So it's just a really bad situation for the people there. And this could really explode too, because there are the Palestinian armed factions in the West Bank. I'm not really sure how big they are, but you know, they are there. So it could be another front really for Israel. All right, so the next one here, hundreds of thousands march for Gaza in London. So this is another one from Middle East Eye. So all around the world, there's been protests for Gaza, for, you know, calling for an end to Israel's onslaught in Gaza, calling for a ceasefire, pro-Palestinian demonstrations. It seems pretty significant. In London, there was hundreds of thousands of people, which is a huge number. And in New York, there was a few thousand, and more than 100 people were arrested. So they say the crowd was about 1,000 demonstrators, and 130 people were arrested by the NYPD. This was on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan that these protests took place. And if you scroll down to the lower section, you'll see we have a section called the World Reaction to Gaza, to what's going on in Gaza. And there's protests just all over the world. Tunisia, I know in Australia, Malaysia, Paris, just tons of protests. You know, so it seems pretty significant, kind of the world reaction to what's going on. Oh, before I get out of the Israel-Gaza stuff, I want to go to a story that's in our blog that we reprinted from the Ron Paul Institute. This is from Dan McAdams. And it says, former U.S. Representative Justin Amash's relatives were killed in an Israeli bombing. So Justin Amash is a former member of Congress. He did not leave very long ago. He was a Republican, but he switched his party to Libertarian. He's from Michigan, and he's a Palestinian, descendant of Palestinian refugees. He's Christian, and his family is Christian. And if you remember, there was Israeli airstrikes, I believe it was Thursday night, that targeted a Greek Orthodox church in southern Gaza, or no, they were in Gaza City, and it killed about 18 people, and some of them were relatives of Justin Amash. So, I mean, it really goes to show the civilian toll here that's being taken on these people. You know, Palestinian Christians sheltering in a church, even they're not safe from this. And there are a lot of Palestinian Americans that have families there who are really in, you know, they just have nowhere to go, and they're just completely desperate. And I know from people I've talked to, they have WhatsApp where they can talk to them, and it goes in and out, so you won't hear from them because they lose power. Internet goes out, so they don't hear from them for a while, and they don't know what's happening to them. So it's just got to be really, you know, tough to deal with. All right, so getting into another topic, Chinese and Philippine vessels collide in the South China Sea. So a Chinese Coast Guard vessel and a Philippine resupply boat collided near a disputed reef in the South China Sea as tensions in the waters between Beijing and Manila continue to rise. Both sides blamed the other for what China described as a minor collision. No injuries were reported in the incident, which took place near Second Thomas Shoal, which is part of the Spratly Islands, and these are all claimed by China, the Philippines, and I believe Vietnam also claims the Spratly Islands. Yeah, if you look at the map here, it shows all the overlapping claims in the South China Sea. But this is an area of tensions between China and the Philippines. So it looks like there was a collision. Again, it was described as minor, and the Chinese Coast Guard, of course, is blaming the Philippine side, and then the Philippines is blaming China. And what the Philippine boat was doing was trying to resupply this grounded World War II era ship that's on Second Thomas Shoal. The Philippines intentionally grounded this ship there in 1999 to assert their claims to the shoal, and they use it as kind of a base of operations. And these are resupply missions that China has been kind of trying to block more and more lately, as on the other side, you have the Philippine government of Ferdinand Marcos Jr., which came in last year. They've been taking a much more, aggressive approach toward China, and they're really solidifying military ties with the U.S. So there's been a lot of these incidents, and this is an area that I always keep a close eye on over the past few years. And this year, there's really been a lot of incidents between these Chinese and Philippine boats. And the reason why I pay attention to this is because the U.S. backs the Philippines in this maritime dispute. And they don't just take the Philippine side and say, China's wrong, these are Philippine reefs or whatever. The U.S. actually has pledged to intervene if China fires on Philippine boats. The U.S. and the Philippines have a mutual defense treaty, and the U.S. has repeatedly reaffirmed that defense treaty applies to attacks on Philippine vessels in the South China Sea. They actually formalized that pledge when they issued new guidelines. So that's why, if they start shooting at each other, who knows what could happen. And it's turned this part of the world into a potential flashpoint for a war between the U.S. and China. All right, so the last one here is one from Kyle Anzalone over at the Libertarian Institute. The U.S., Japan, and South Korea hold their first joint aerial exercises. So the U.S., South Korea, and Japan kicked off their first ever aerial war games near the Korean Peninsula. So this is a big part of the U.S. strategy against China, is forming new alliances in the region, and kind of this trilateral military alliance between the U.S., South Korea, and Japan is a big part of it. The U.S. has been trying to get South Korea and Japan to work out their differences, and here we have them. They've previously conducted maritime drills, but this is their first trilateral aerial exercise, and a U.S. nuclear-capable B-52 bomber engaged in these operations, in these drills. And that is it for the news for today. That was a lot of stuff. That's just what happens when I am off for the weekend and things build up. I hope I didn't throw too much information at you there, but go check out our Viewpoints, please. We have one from David Stockman, Joe Biden's hideous $106 billion war package. One from William J. Astore, peace dividends not in our lifetime. One from Caitlin Johnstone, insane idea that nations get to do war crimes when something bad happens. One from Michael Clare, drone warfare in the nuclear age. And one from Branko Marchteach, Abraham Accords set the stage for Israel-Gaza conflict. And again, go check out our blog. There was a memorial for Daniel Ellsberg that was held on Sunday, and it was streamed online. If you want to go check that out, Eric posted it in the blog. It's pretty long. It's 3 hours long, but you could check out some of the speakers and stuff. And, he lived quite the life, so maybe 3 hours really isn't that long for a memorial for Ellsberg. But go check that out and read some other stuff in our blog. Again, just because you watch or listen to this show doesn't mean you don't have to go to antiwar.com and check things out. With this Gaza stuff, there's been so much news. I've been sorting through like hundreds of articles of just Gaza and Israel. So if you go to the lower section of the page, you see, there's a lot of stuff down here that, just about kind of individual airstrikes and accounts from people on the ground. So, lots of information there that we organize for you. All right. You could always help the show by sharing it, telling your friends about antiwar.com. Like and subscribe if you watch on YouTube. Rumble or Odyssey. If you listen to the podcast, you could leave a rating or a review. Again, sharing it is also a big help. But that's it for me for today. I'll be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.